What's up, team? I guess I screwed that whole thing up. It never works the same. You were supposed to get a beautiful outside view while you waited, but instead you got the inside of this room while I set up. I didn't understand what was going on. So, well, you might have seen a bit of the snow. It's okay. But the sun's up, the sun's up. I checked. Bitcoin running despite the really interesting decrease in hash rate, but benevolent and great. And nothing but good news. So let's have our coffee and talk about the rest of the good news. You got the window view. So what happened when I turned it around? Because when I first turned on, good morning, Helios. When I first turned it on, I saw the back camera. Anyway, I don't know. I don't know. That's why it's not easy to do the show on the road. But the good news is I'll be at the new studio, which I got to set up, but I'll be at the new studio in a few days. We fly to the south on New Year's Eve. So the golden age of fraud, the golden age of fraud is upon us. As if we didn't know already as Bitcoiners, as if we didn't know the golden age of fraud was on us. But just seeing everything that happened with SBF in the past few weeks, and now we got a lot of new fraud stories out. So let's go over all the fun fraud out there. So the funniest thing I found, there's so much going on, so much. But this headline that the New York Times conjured, they're continuously searching for new ways to cover SBF. It was, oh, he can't realize all of his philanthropic goals. It's going to be so hard for SBF. Oh, my goodness, what are we going to do? But this is a brand new one. You got to mention when there's new angles on how to cover SBF because, the fake news is always looking for stories to copy. And once you get a new angle to copy, you can churn out a lot more. So here's the new one. In the US, Sam Bankman-Fried is persona non grata. But in interviews across the Bahamas, residents say that his crimes were hardly comparable to the gang violence of the island and express fears of economic fallout if crypto investors don't return. So it's like, if you just pay a lot for your Uber Eats, it's okay. You can steal $10 billion. You got to make sure you tip all the people that help you with the bags and stuff. But the 10 billion from America, come on, it's fine. It's fine. The funniest golden age of fraud story going around is this Congressman-elect George Santos. Has anyone heard of this guy? So he's a Republican who managed to eke out a win in a New York State election to be a congressman. But it turns out his entire resume is a scam. So he said he went to Harvard, never went to Harvard. All of his education's a scam. He said he worked for Goldman Sachs, never worked for Goldman Sachs. That's a scam. I think he said he's Jewish, but totally not Jewish. Totally not Jewish. Now, think about why you would lie about one of these things. There must be an advantage. So he said he would lie. He said he was Jewish, but now here's the golden age of fraud thing that's amazing, right? It's amazing. Everyone out there is saying, come on, he's got to quit. How can he get elected on lies and then stay in office? But when you actually stop and look at whatever provisions they might have to boot him from there, there's nothing. Because if they ever applied a standard of lying and then you couldn't be in Congress, I mean, the answer. There wouldn't be anyone there. There'd be no one there. Biden openly has been caught lying his whole career. He lied about his colleges. He lied about his degrees. He's lied about travels he took. He's lied about, there was the one where he went to South Africa to meet with Mandela, total scam. The list goes on and on, right? He's been lying. He had to stop presidential election campaigns when he was going for a Democrat primary in previous elections because he was such a liar. Like, he was a known liar for years. His campaign, I think, in the 90s to be president finished because he lied about his education, lied about his grades in law school, lied about all kinds of stuff. And he's not the only one. I mean, this Santos guy is operating on, AOC level or Trump level. Trump is the first one to really harness this power of just lying and participating in the American democratic system, which is why I supported Trump so much in his first go-around, because he was the first person who said, Well, if I lie, you don't get in trouble. So what can I do? I can lie all the time. I can do max lying, and win because there's no repercussions. You could just stay one lie ahead of the game, and while they're picking up the pieces from the previous lie, you're onto the new one, and then it just rinse and repeat. You keep going, and it was really great, right? So I know on this channel we've been open Fetterman 2024 advocates. So Fetterman, I still think, is one of the best candidates we can get for the role right now, and I really hope he throws his hat in to win the Democrat nomination. Going against Biden would be pretty cool because we got the liar who's got brain troubles versus the guy with quite a bit more brain troubles. But it'll be a good fight. But I'm starting to think the Santos guy might actually, I mean, I would put him in the ring right now. I think he should, there's people saying he should quit. Forget about quit. He should go one step further and say, I'm running for Republican nomination for president. I would support him. I would support Santos for Republican nomination. What's the difference? Let's go, Santos. Come on. Now everyone's saying he's got to quit. Why, you can't get elected lying. Again, there would be no one there. There would just be no one there. If there was any function to remove someone from office for lying, the game would be over. You can remove people from office for crimes. Crimes are the only way that I know of. I've been involved in people being removed from Parliament in Canada for crimes. Lying is not a crime. We all know that, right? It's a sin, but it's not a crime. So in this case, right, we think there is a great opportunity here for Santos to really underline what's going on. And we are in the golden age of fraud, right? We're in the golden age of fraud. Look at the Arizona case, right? The Arizona case. Remember what I said on the show weeks and weeks ago. When this started, I said the best possible outcome of Arizona for Bitcoiners and for everyone who wants to change the world and come up with systems, the best possible answer for what happened in Arizona was the following: that the cheating and the lying and the craziness were so obvious and so in front of everyone, but that it still goes to the courts, and the courts say, it's good enough. Not really much we can do, right? So that really was the best case scenario, and that's what we were hoping for on this channel. That's what we were predicting would happen. We said that the proof of what happened in Arizona would be obvious to anyone who can put the logic together and hold 2 or 3 thoughts in their head simultaneously. You'd see the conclusion very clearly. I said for a long time, the best scenario is that Bitcoiners see the architecture that went into this consensus-making mechanism that they call elections in Arizona, and would say, well, I mean, if there's that kind of distribution of accounting between different nodes, and there is no really accounting at all, right? The whole thing that she proved in court, Carrie Lake, was that there was no, even though by law they were supposed to have them, there was no tally of votes from one place they went to from the other. So you could just make up an arbitrary number at the end, and there would be no way to determine if at every step along the way that tally was the same, that count was the same. So what I'm saying is you could have 100 votes that went in at the beginning, and you're supposed to check at the next station, it's still the same 100 votes in the box, and then the next one is still the same 100 votes in the box. Just like the whole Merkle tree aspect of Bitcoin transactions, it's supposed to always add up along the chain of, in this case, it's not custody in Bitcoin, but in the case of the votes, it's a chain of custody. So it's supposed to go on the chain of custody. And by law, they were supposed to have the actual vote counts each and every time, but that was never there. So that was proven by the court. But because we're talking about intent, and we talk about intent all the time on this show, right? Intentions are everything when it comes to criminal law. The burden for the Carrie Lake team was more than just prove whether or not the mechanisms were broken. They had to prove there was intention to break the mechanisms. So they were not able to determine that, even though, as we always like to remind everyone, the person running the election was also the candidate, right? So the person running the election was the candidate running against the other person, and the person running the election was responsible for things like making sure the systems adhered to the law, which prescribed vote tallies to travel with the boxes, but that never happened. So the best case scenario for Bitcoiners is to see the architecture as fraudulent, and maybe not so much fraudulent as totally incredulous, right? Completely incredulous. And this is a design choice. We've talked a lot about the design choices that were made for this election. And you don't get to have the election that is easy to participate in, no ID, for example, but is also credible, right? You have to give a little bit. It can be credible, but then it's not easy to participate in. You got to show ID, you got to show up at a certain time, and all those things. What we got was what the court said, I don't know, it's not intent, so we can't really prove anything. We're not going to overturn the election. But we know that the election lacked credibility. So for Bitcoiners, this is kind of the best scenario, because what it's going to do is squeeze out anyone who still thought they could change the system from the inside using these mechanisms. Now, it doesn't mean one day we won't change the system from the inside using these mechanisms, but it won't be the way we get to the top of the hill, right? It's not going to be the way you become king of the castle. It's not going to work that way. You're going to get kicked down too easily if you try and approach from these attack vectors. But that's good message for Bitcoiners, and really good that we see now clearly, without any, I think, even debate, that when you don't even have the elections adhering to what are supposed to be the easier to participate in compromises, when they can't even adhere to those, chain of custody probably being the most important thing you would consider if you were allowing extra voting stations, extra time to vote, all those things. It would probably be the most important element you'd want to make sure you control. They didn't do it, not even close. So they didn't even have an election, is what I think a lot of Bitcoiners should think, right? After seeing all this, there's a way to have a confirmed, credible transaction within an election, and they didn't have it. They didn't have one. So Bitcoiners looking at that can now, I think, positively, without any internal debate amongst our own folks, say they lack credibility, which is a big step, because Bitcoiners being divided along the lines of national elections, it's very bad for us. Right? It's very bad for us. We don't want to import that kind of disharmony, let's say, right? It opens up a lot of ways to manipulate Bitcoiners themselves. And luckily, I predict we're going to definitely unify. Whether our political leanings are different or not, it won't really matter. I think over an understanding of infrastructure, architecture, and systems, will be pretty aligned that this one is part of the golden age of fraud, just like George Santos and just like the coverage of SBF. Now, one of the things that made me think of just seeing the election, the golden age of fraud, and how much things have changed, and how much national identity remains a huge obstacle for America, for lots of countries in the world that still can't really look in the mirror at their own national identity and see what horrible characteristics they import because they identify with a national identity. Where does national identity even come from, right? It really was promoted and calcified during the world wars. World War I, World War II had a lot to do with the promotion and adherence of national identity. Remember, Germany wasn't even a country previous to the 1860s. Germany was a series of principalities that lacked all national identity. They had a cultural identity, but a national one. So there's a difference between cultural identity and national identity. They're not the same thing. China has multiple cultural identities. There's only one national identity promoted by the CCP. There's a historic Chinese identity, of course, but mostly from the Han people. Now, it's a very complicated place, and I don't want to speak with any authority on China about identities and all that, because I could get it wrong. It's a very complicated country, and I have limited experience there. I've traveled a few times, but I certainly am only scratching the surface of what I know of China. But what I do know is there are multiple cultural identities within the country. The national identity was something the Communist Party tried to conjure, and has done a lot to formalize within the country. But I did something. This is something someone else recorded, and it made me think. They looked over a dictionary from 1894 and just looked at the definition of person, right? So this is a dictionary written before the World Wars, right? That's why I bring up the World Wars. So someone read the Webster's Dictionary from before World War I and II, before the Federal Reserve even. And it's funny when you look at the definition of, so first of all, compare the two books. Compare the dictionary from 1894 to the dictionary today, right? So the dictionary from 1894 is like this thick. The dictionary from today is about this thick. And there's a lot of context put into all of those stories. And the 1894 definition of person, right? Just person, just plain word, right? You'd think it would be recognizable. You think the world wouldn't have changed that much. But the number one, listed one under the definition of person is the following. Persona, used by actors, a mask, part of a person. They go on, there's several other definitions, but only at the bottom do they get to the definition that approaches a human being, so something that we would understand and recognize. But that's not the first one. That's not the first one, right? Compare it to today, right? Compare it to the 2022 version of the Webster Dictionary. Person is now a human individual, sometimes used in combination, especially by those who prefer to avoid man in compounds. So the new definition is really just one of these gender identity things, right? So person is a word used because you don't want to insult someone by gendering man or woman. So you put this person thing in the middle. That's what it's turned into, right? According to the most, number one, let's just use our list bias, I guess you could say, and say if you put something at the top, it's probably more important, probably the more colloquial version or the most common use of the term. So before, our perception of person really was the masks, the persona, the thing you put on. And that has sort of blended away, right? Now it is literally the political representation and the political usage of the term that's become more important. And it's funny because COVID, and even when we talk about Hollywood, Wall Street, right? You can kind of tell, as a Bitcoiner, you can tell what media a person is consuming. It's very obvious, right? Around COVID, you could tell just based on anxiety, just based on what people were consuming, that they were spending a lot of time with media that would make them anxious and so forth. You see it with people who spend a lot of time with that Wall Street media. What are they going to say? What are they going to do? As if everything that comes out of the Federal Reserve is the end-all be-all and will totally upend and recreate or reestablish right and wrong and up and down just because they said it. So this is very different, right? So it seems almost like 100 years ago, they knew that persona was much more malleable than the current definitions. The current definitions in the Webster dictionaries have just absorbed a current almost national identity slant to it. Now, I'm not saying American national identity is based on the current idea of gender, but the current expression of what kind of an American you are, what kind of national identity you're assuming, what media you read is related to that definition. So it became a political definition, right? They put the actual politics into the definition. And, it ends up reminding me, there's an old experiment that I also came across, people talking about Stanford experiment a lot these days, and Stanford experiment, of course, where these personas were assigned to people and, guards or prisoners. People forget that the prisoners in the Stanford experiment were really treated like actual prisoners in the sense that the local police actually went and arrested them the morning where they were supposed to be beginning the experiment. The guards were not told, of course, that they were the ones being studied. They thought the prisoners were being studied, but of course it was the guards being studied and what they would do with the personas that they were assigned to them. And they saw quickly that these new personalities came out that identified with these powerful roles that had authority over others and could do stuff to them, right? And before that, a lot of these people thought they were normal. They acted normally. There was one psychologist who helped put the study to an end, because the study, of course, the Stanford study came to an end early, because one psychologist who went there and spoke with one of the guards was immediately taken by that guard's charisma, charm, but then shocked when the guard put the mask on to be the guard again, just how cruel they had become in such a short amount of time. And there's another experiment that looks a little similar, but not with human beings. And this one's with mice. It's called the, what did they call it again? Universe 25. Universe 25. They called it Universe 25 because the person who ran the experiment took 25 attempts to create the following: a mouse colony with walls and a limited amount of space, but almost like apartments and different levels, different places where some mice could protect easier, like one avenue of access, so more aggressive mice could actually have a home in this environment. So they started with 4 males, 4 females in this colony. And the population started great, right? They had everything they needed to eat. There was never a limit to anything. The experimenters would give them everything they required, so they instantly started to reproduce really quickly. And the population went straight up. And this was a type of utopia, because they had like I said, they had everything they needed. There was furnishings, places to go, things to do. It was a massive environment. And the population peaked. And now what ended up happening was the following. Some mice just stuck in the middle, and those mice in the end were controlled by other mice who kept big portions of the environment protected. What the researchers ended up dubbing the beautiful ones lived there, behind the protection of these few aggressive, strong male mice. And the beautiful ones were the only ones who ended up being able to reproduce, because the other ones were just around each other. There was no more room. They would get trampled. Now, the beautiful ones would sometimes, and even the normal mice, if they did happen to have children, they would abandon them immediately. They wouldn't care for them. The beautiful ones would only care for a certain amount of mice. The other ones, they would just ship back to the middle of the pack. And in the end, the population goes up, but then collapses to nothing. It ends up totally wiping out, because they lose their will to live. They become listless. They simply cannot function any longer without intervention from someone outside, right? And one of the takeaways that you can get from this experiment is that personality and environment are 100% linked, right? They're the same thing almost. That the environment, like the Stanford experiment, or like this experiment with the mice, this is not a natural way mice would behave at all, right? They wouldn't form these exact types of social interactions, and they certainly wouldn't become so listless to live, right? That was one of the real big observations, is the lack of motivation. They'd sort of forgotten how to survive and how to live, and they only had herd mentality. And the herd mentality is what killed most of them in the end. And not being able to think for themselves, more or less, and falling into the same panic that was all around them. And then the panic that was all around them spread into almost a disease where they didn't want to go forward. They couldn't, one would imagine why they should keep going, right? You could see that the lack of attention to the next generation, all those things. Even the ones that were living in the special area stopped mating in general, right? They weren't really into mating anymore. So all these things were observed in this experiment called the Universe 25 mouse experiment. And it makes me think of this personality and environment being so related, especially when you look at everything to do with national identity and how it was promoted heavily at the time World War I began. Now, what else began when World War I started? Does anyone remember? Right, of course, the Federal Reserve begins at the same time as World War I. They come together. They're a package. They come along with income tax. So all at once, the world deals with its first major war, entirely fueled by national identity, And that war, right, is ended because America falls for a false flag, right? World War I ends. The bloodiest, worst war we've ever seen, right? World War II, other than the nukes, is really kind of pedestrian compared to what Europe experienced anyway in World War I. In World War I, you had entire towns wiped out, no males left. You had death and destruction on a scale at which we have never seen again, and it shocked people's consciousness. You know, I was a fan of the Peaky Blinders show. Peaky Blinders, based on veterans coming home from World War I in the tunnels. You know, you had thousands of people who died in tunnels, who drowned in mud, and all for national identity. And America enters this war on a false flag, right? They enter because it was said that a US passenger ship was sunk by the Germans. But in fact, the US passenger ship was a lot like these ships we're sending to Ukraine these days that are filled with weapons. And it was a way for the Americans to participate in World War I without actually participating. It was the same old, arms type support that was given in World War II as well. And at the time, the president was also mentally deficient. It was Woodrow Wilson. He had had a stroke, and so he was not all there, and his wife was doing most of this stuff. So the false flag happened while the president was not cognizant and didn't have the brain capacity. He was a proponent before he had the stroke. He was a proponent of the war before he had the stroke, and wanted to go to war, but was lacking the complete will of the American people. The American people not so interested. And so finally, when this false flag happened, the excuse to go to World War I was there. The ship sank, even though it was a military ship, and so America rushed in, kicked everyone's ass, because just like World War II, they were all tired, and the Americans had been sitting around in America, right? Like they got the best, strongest people. Everyone else had lost their best and strongest. So when the Americans showed up, they were just coming in the last quarter fully fresh and dunking on everyone. And they won, no problem. And of course, national identity explodes. Now, I'm not saying there were no national identities before World War I. That's not true. The British had a imperial national identity. The French certainly, for a long time, have had a national identity. France being an exception, England being an exception. Italy, brand new country, right? Italy is not an old country at all. Canada is older than Italy, right? Much older, much older. Italy formed after these different principalities couldn't make the nation, the little city-states work anymore, so they joined together and created a nation. So this whole national identity thing, right, goes to that idea of personality and environment being so linked. And because so many people do put on a national identity and really make their national identity a big part of their actual identity, this is new, right? That your national identity, which is not the same as a tribal identity, right? It's not the same at all. National identity, very different. Now, if you think of the definition, as we did in 1894, of person, right, of person, they knew it was a mask. And I think their knowledge of its malleability, of its plasticity, was maybe greater at the time, right? Psychology and all of these subjects were brand new. And the idea that the mind was plastic was a lot more present in people's minds when you had someone like Freud who could be quoted daily. And remember, we've talked a lot about Freud's nephew on this show, right? Edward Bernays, who helped create national identity in America, right? He helped form it. There's no doubt about it. And it was formed for various reasons, which we might agree with today or might disagree with, right? The whole idea of making Americans into consumers was a national defense choice. And in the case of Edward Bernays, he helped popularize smoking amongst women, and then turned his mind against it later on when he understood the evils of smoking. So this is not a man who is inherently evil, not inherently evil, but understood the plasticity of the human mind, as did many people at that time. As I said, the 1894 definition of person showed and underlined its plasticity. The current definition, which is a absolute political definition, identifying the word person in its political usage, as in not to gender language, right, as a gender neutral language, right, expresses more about the change and than people might realize, right? Whereas once you said human persona is malleable, and that's its number one definition, right? The malleability and the mask you put on, versus today, which is this national political slant to it, shows just how much things have changed, right? Personality becoming environment, and the environment now is 100% nation state based. And the reason it's 100% nation state based, as Bitcoiners will tell you, the money that flows around the world has fused state in a way that religion was capable of doing at one time, but in a way that in our society today is the most effective for control. If you make money and personality, money and the state combined to this extent, you can actually fund, you can subsidize national identity. I've heard the fellow Alan Farrington, right? Alan Farrington. If you guys haven't read Alan Farrington, he has the Bitcoin is Venice, so a very similar idea to what we're talking about here: city-states, nation-states, the bludgeon that is the national identity. What he said fiat has done is that it's subsidized narcissism, right? It's subsidized narcissism. That's one of his famous quotes, right? That fiat has subsidized narcissism. That's a great way of putting it. And I'm not trying to argue with that point of view. I think a very similar way of stating it, and I think is mostly concurrent, is that we have fiat has subsidized national identity. National identity being perhaps a form of narcissism as well. So we're not here to make that argument. I'm just saying that it's a very similar relationship, right? That it's a subsidized identity. And this identity can then be easily downloaded onto people. And that's what you see when you think about some of these other stories in the news, right? Like, think of these interest rate debates going on right now, right? You've got Elon Musk, who's saying this might be the worst thing that the Federal Reserve has ever done, right? It might be the worst thing the Federal Reserve has ever done. And there's other folks saying, well, we have to do it because inflation and all these things. The patriotism that Americans have, we've said for a long, it's literally the reason why we call this The Breakup. It's the reason why the show is called The Breakup, because, we teach finance, interest rates like it's math. It's numbers, but it's not math at all. Math has nothing to do with this, right? We teach finance like it's math. There's nothing mathematical about it other than there's numbers involved. That's it. That there's numbers involved doesn't mean it's math. It just means that we use numbers to track what's going on. It's not really the definition of what's happening. And because of that gap, right? Because of the gap between seeing all of the economy, between seeing the economy as numbers or psychology, is where we get into a lot of this trouble. I've said for a long time that America won World War II and World War I. American institutions won World War I and World War II. But Americans lost. They didn't get anything, right? They got to get all the consumption. They got to get some of the spoils of war. But they didn't really win as individuals. And I've said for a long time that one of the great advantages that the old world has over America when it comes to Bitcoin, China in particular, China knows they have a country, right? They're a country. they have culture. They know their money and their institutions are not the same thing. Those are new things and have nothing to do with ancient Chinese culture or even slightly older Chinese culture, right? So in that case, there's this huge divide. There's a huge divide in being able to understand what's driving things forward. This show says that one of the biggest inhibitions in America is national identity. It is the incapacity to see the trouble the country causes because of our patriotism. And because there is that gap, there's because there is that gap, Americans think that protecting all American institutions is a requirement for national identity or patriotism or the perpetuation of America, where we don't really say that we now live in the golden age of fraud and environment and persona are the same thing. And we have allowed actual criminals to take over the country. Real, like I'm not just, oh, that guy's a criminal. If you look at the annotated Hunter Biden laptop and Joe and all that stuff, right? If you look at it, I mean, no one's debunked it, so I'm waiting for a debunk. If I heard an excuse, right? If I heard a reason that made sense to me, I would be willing to change my mind. But from what I see there, Hunter Biden and the dad are part of a real massive crime family, for real, like no doubt about it. Not like, oh, that's maybe a crime. I mean, a legit organized crime family. And it's hard for Americans to accept that. It's very difficult. It doesn't sound, it's almost like what I'm saying must be hyperbole, or maybe that's not true. I don't know, I'll look into it. I can't see any other way to see it. Now, again, like we said about Carrie Lake and everything, intent matters, right? I don't think there's any way to make Joe Biden a criminal, even though we have all that stuff in the Hunter Biden files in the laptop, because we don't really see intent. There's plenty of plausible deniability situations going on there. I think they even use the word, I think there's even the words said in one of the texts between like the uncle and Hunter, well, the game we're playing is plausible deniability for the big guy. Like they literally come out and say the game they're playing is for him to be protected with a plausible deniability circumstance. And, we've charted here how LBJ, right, helped bring that crime aspect in. And now go again and look at this history of national identities being invocated for the benefit of these criminals, right? We see World War I and World War II, all based off national identity, right? All based off patriotism, all based off of the conjuring of more national identities that you need to live up to, right? Americans are this, Americans are that. We don't leave people behind. Save Private Ryan. Let's go do all this great stuff, and we're amazing, right? Now, I do think America has. I'm a believer in American exceptionalism. I do. I think it's an exceptional place. Lots about it is exceptional, right? But that doesn't mean they're perfect, right? And that doesn't mean everything about their national exceptionalism is great. There's good parts and bad parts. And in general, though, I still think America is one of the most positive things that have ever happened in history, by far, precisely because we took people without national identities to weigh us down. Right? America already has less of a national identity burden than most places in the world. They don't bring a lot of the baggage. Look at Japan. You know what a hassle it is to be Japanese? I mean, the amount of things you have to do right in order to just qualify in their own world. France is the same, right? What they call culture in France, what they call their national identity in France, is a really hard standard for most people to live up to. I understand why French people have to leave. If you're not good at this and you're not good at that, there's no place for you in France. There just isn't. And places that have these really difficult national identities can be like that. Now, the thing America had was it had a very easy national identity to begin with, right? And that's what was manipulated. That's the vacuum that was filled with all kinds of messaging around what it means to be American and this and that. And you can see it in Ukraine now. You can see the results of all of that formation, right? All of that fortification of the American national identity that now is all around. So, if you think about environment, personality being so linked, you can start to understand. And then the knowledge that people once understood these were malleable, way more than I think we understand today. We're living in the manipulated version of something they knew was manipulatable 100 years ago, right? And the definition in the dictionary today saying, here's what it is, right? Person is a word used to not offend people. Right? That's the political definition, the current political definition, entirely related to national identity, entirely related to the messaging system, right? And if you think of, here's even the storm, right? The storm in the past few days. Here's another example. 30 people now dead. Like that's the storm you see outside, right? I'm in the Midwest, the Canadian version of the Midwest, but we got the storm too. So if you see that, it's 30 people dead, right? So the LA Times runs a story today. The LA Times runs a story today saying America's energy matrix sucks, right? So we talk about that all the time on this show. We're all about energy literacy on the show. We talk about it regularly. But do they say in that article that it's because of their bad choices in wind and solar? So no, they don't actually. They say that the problem with America's energy matrix now is that it's too reliant on natural gas, and natural gas, even in cold snaps, is trouble. Well, the trouble in the cold snap is easily mitigated because it's not a lot of days, and they had to use their reserves in the United States in order to pump the natural gas out into New England and the Midwest. And they're saying, oh, we got dangerously low, right? Well, no, they didn't get dangerously low at all. They used some and dipped into the reserves, and the reserves went to their lowest since 2018 or some nonsense number like that. But it's not systematically a problem to get natural gas, even if we have these huge storms. So instead of facing the actual arguments about our grid instability being too reliant on wind and solar, they just went and attacked natural gas because they had a data point. And because national identity, right, the whole conjuring of moral choices around electrical grid engineering led us to this result. And now we've got all these dead people, and they won't face reality about what happened, right? They won't face the reality. Natural gas is especially difficult with cold weather because of Boyle's law, which I think means the volume shrinks if is that Boyle's law, as I'm remembering. Humanity needs large battery technology. Store the surplus energy on large batteries. Yeah. This is James saying we need large battery technologies. Yeah, and the good news is, as I understand anyway, the Nobel Prizes have already been handed out in those fields. The graphene stuff, the whole shrinking of the atomic scale, right? Because I guess silicon has atomic limitations, even in the wafers and all that. And that's one reason why they got into the graphene design. But what they found with the graphene is that it does have immense you can make a supercapacitor out of it, so you can store a lot of energy in it. Now, as far as I understand, it's just an engineering problem now. The whole battery situation is no longer a science problem. It was a science problem until they found out what they could do with the scale, nanotech scale. And that's the reason I mentioned the silicon, is that one of the reasons they went that far was because Moore's law was being infringed upon, or the limits of Moore's law were coming up because of the size of the silicon atom. And so once they started to really get down into those building blocks, and they realized they could create structures, and they found the carbon lattice structure, they knew they were able to create these things. Interestingly, did you know that nanotech, its version of it, is also what makes stained glass beautiful? That's all a form of nanotechnology that they stumbled upon, and that's what actually gives it its color. Liquid metal batteries, graphene supercapacitors, algae battery pools. I've seen the algae battery pools. Yeah, we could also use a thorium nuclear. Yeah, the thorium stuff I'm a huge fan of. Huge fan of the thorium. Gonna go some of these. Whoa, lots of comments here, teams. Joe, you're back. Good morning, Steve. Yeah, back, guys. Assalamu alaikum, Muslim Bitcoiner. Justin says, wasn't watching at that moment, but it was a beautiful suburban cul-de-sac. Good. Yeah, that's where we are. We're at my in-laws. That's why things have been a little hard to do a show here. We had extra people in this house. Welcome to the BTC overlay. Thanks, Bitcoin Graffiti. I was just reading about the crypto dark pool. Scary stuff. Does BTC need regulation to protect it from easy lending and dark pools? Can we take it off the dark pools? James, every exchange is a dark pool of capital in Bitcoin, unfortunately. I'd say not everyone. Kraken is good, guys. I work there. I mean, I have a pretty good idea of what goes on there. Let's talk Noster, Bitcoin Graffiti. Yeah, I'm going to set my Noster up before January 2nd. I haven't done it yet just because it's been hopping all around, but I am going to start using the Noster stuff, Bitcoin Graffiti. I saw your tweet as well. Going to do it. Really just the exceptional days of the holidays that keep me from there. I want to see Jeffrey Sachs and Jesse Ventura. Same accent and critical fingers more than we normally see. Yeah, I like Jeffrey Sachs and Jesse Ventura. I have been a fan of James. I've always sort of liked the shtick that he's got. Bitcoin Graffiti, pound the like button. Let's like and subscribe, team. We love it. We love it. We love it. Sailor just bought another 2,500 Bitcoin. Good for Sailor. We love him. Joe Valdez, isn't it a crime to falsify information on an application? I think Joe's referring here to the fella in. Yeah, I think it normally is a crime to falsify information on an application, but you don't apply to a job in Congress. You get elected, so there is no application process. And if people, as I understand, when you sign your nomination papers, that is the tacit approval of your resume, which it always should be. You know, for example, Switzerland has the best immigration system in the world. Do you know how you immigrate to Switzerland? Do you know how? First of all, Switzerland, no leader, right? The cantons, the states rotate the leadership, but there is no formal leader. So I think there's 10 or 11 cantons. I don't remember. Canton just means township. It's a way to distribute land. So the cantons, the French, where I live in Vermont, you guys see on the other side of the border, the Canadian side where I grew up, that's called the Eastern Townships. But when you translate it into French, it's called les cantons de l'Est, the cantons of the East, because they didn't divide land the same as the French Canadians did. They divided land according to the English square lots, and the French just needed to borrow the name when they, a lot of Afrikaners stuff in Quebec, by the way, as in like they'll change the name of things in order for it to be French. There's like a river that runs into my area called Pike River, which is the name of a fish that you can catch in the river. But on the Quebec side, they had to translate the name, even though there's towns and everything called Pike River. So there's a lot of funny things like that. So the word canton can mean township, but it's what they have in Switzerland. To emigrate to Switzerland, you have to convince your neighbors to let you in. That's it. That's the process. If your neighbors say you're in, you're in. But it's a pretty hard standard, right? It's pretty hard. But I think it's great and would allow for, you don't have to worry about your app, because that's the big thing in Canadian immigration, which I worked in as a student. Anytime you lie in Canadian immigration, you're cooked. Anytime you're cooked, right? If you come to Canada and say you have no dependents, but then, 2 years later, I did have a daughter, I did have a son, sorry, I forgot to mention, never, you're done. You get to stay because it's too late, but no one can use any sponsorship or anything like that. So the Canadian immigration system severely punishes lying, severely. And most people are okay with that, of course, right? Most people agree with that. But I don't think in any parliament or in any Congress or anything like that, there can be. If they ever instituted a rule like Joe is mentioning, isn't it a crime to falsify information on an application? For a normal job, for you and me to do a normal thing, yeah, for sure. Congress, I don't believe so. I think it's up to this guy, George, to quit. And I hope he doesn't. I hope he sticks around. I think it's hilarious. Too much fun. Jeffrey Sachs and President Ventura for President Drool. Yeah, they could be good. Steve Paris, we knew chain of custody was broken in many states in 2020. How it's been recorded officially, I guess. Yeah, so chain of custody, big part of. Now, again, we said the best case scenario was what happened, right? The best case scenario was what happened. Because if the system worked and then things changed, I don't know. I mean, look, guys, we got to go on a mission to change national identity here, right? It's got to be changed. It's got to be altered. So if any success from the normal systems would play out like in Arizona, I think in some ways it would diminish our overall desire or capacity to flip things 180. We're trying to flip reality upside down, right? Change everything. And that becomes easier the more the system relies on lies and getting caught lying red-handed. And so we see it red-handed here. It's pretty clear. It's pretty clear. Now we love Katie Hobbs as governor of Arizona. We acknowledge it, we move on, and we think it's great. She's the best governor we could have hoped for. She's the best. She's the best. The other one was, you know, it's like if Trump was still president, would the dollar really be suffering as much as it is, and or benefiting as much as it is, right? Would we have the imbalance in national financial policies if Trump was still around? Probably not. Probably not, right? The thing about Trump was he was a good shitcoin pumper. Really great. I mean, really great shitcoin pumper. And his coin would have done great under him. And that's not really the game I want to be playing. I like the guy who can't really speak and doesn't really know where he is, and maybe his wife is got to tell him where to eat and poo, and he has all these rumors that he keeps pooing himself everywhere he goes, and you know, he pooed himself here, he fell, you know, I don't believe any of the stories of him pooing himself, by the way. Those are usually just mean-spirited propaganda instances, but I mean, is there, you know, it's still great, right? And we like it. Bitcoin Graffiti said persona is mask. Exactly. Yes, Bitcoin Graffiti. Greek. The persona is the matrix avatar. Yes. It is how you play in the game. It's not the individual, the facade. Yep. Oh, really? They memory hold. Yeah. They memory hold I think Bitcoin Graffiti here is talking about the dictionary being memory hold. Memory hold. Yeah. It's still in the definitions, but it went from being the first definition, right? Not human being was already known, that a persona and a human being were not really the same thing. That a person and a human being, not really the same thing. Now it's the overtly political definition, right? The gender-neutral anarchists, squatter, ex-neighbors spell it person because the son part implies gender. Gender, yeah. The definition of persona was already for a long time forgotten. It's not weird, it's taken another spin again. Oh, I asked GPT-3 what are the most changed deviating words from their original mythology. They all have to do with foolish, silly, weird. The definitions between funny, strange, weird have heavily shifted their meanings for good and bad. Wow, I didn't know that. I'll check that out. I think the outcomes of those classic experiments where people have, this is from James, have no morals highly depends on the culture. Questioning a uniform could be as normal as blindly believing. Yes. Yeah. Japanese culture is more flexible. This is from Bitcoin Graffiti. Japanese culture is more flexible between role and individual, like they are not the same. People can take over roles. Silly example, Tom Cruise becoming the father, husband in The Last Samurai. Yeah. You want to know something, Bitcoin Graffiti? You know what I looked up before in preparation just to see if I could find material relevant? It was the Japanese writer Yukio Mishima. If any of you don't know who Yukio Mishima is, let me tell you. Yukio Mishima was born into an aristocratic samurai family, but he hopped out of World War II. He didn't go. Got his family to pull strings and just didn't go. After World War II, immediately he became a super celebrity because he wrote a book called something Masks. He was himself a homosexual and talked all about personas and the mask he had to wear in society and what it meant and this and that. Now, he had an amazing life, this guy, Yuki Mishima. He became a bodybuilder and like one of the original, before Arnold Schwarzenegger type of things. A very famous artist. He wrote an amazing uh, magnum opus on the history of Japan, which followed a couple being reincarnated in 4 different epochs of Japan, and they followed the 4 seasons, a lot like the seasonal version of history we talk about on the show with the 4th turning. So the couple was born in the spring in a sort of glory time of Japan, and then covered this couple as they went through different historic iterations of Japan until they came to the winter and the time he was living in, which was prostitutes, not geisha, those kinds of things, and an amazing end to his life. An amazing end to his life. He approached. So he had created a cult following of resurgent samurai nationalists, and went to the emperor and told the emperor, "You have betrayed our country, and you got to step down. It's over. You've made us into this Western consumerist bullshit, and it's going to stop." And he did what a real samurai would have done. He criticized the emperor and then killed himself. He killed himself right there. He's dead. He's dead. He's gone. In like 1971, he killed himself. He almost won the Nobel Prize because of those. He was like, how they do the Nobel Prize. Oh, it's a Japanese person's turn, I guess, because we gave it to a white guy last year. They were already doing that in the old days. And they were eager to give Japan stuff in the 60s and 70s to normalize relations, like the 72 Olympics and the 64 Olympics, and trying to get Japan on the good side. Anyway, this guy was supposed to win the Japanese Nobel Prize, and then didn't, but a few years later killed himself. So indeed, you are correct that the Japanese can, and the other thing about this Yuki Mishiga, he wrote old No theater, NOH, which is predates Kabuki, which is their more modern version of theater, which was integrated with cinema, with a host and some live music and stuff like that. But the No theater, think of it a little bit like our Shakespeare stuff, I guess. This guy Yuki Mishima could write it. He was still capable of writing. Now it might seem anyone could write something. It's just put words on a paper. You can't just write a Shakespeare play today and make it. An AI probably could, but normal people who speak modern English are incapable of writing any Shakespeare. Even the best writer would have a lot of trouble writing a play that you couldn't really tell the difference of. You can tell the difference of authors, but not era. And he was able to do that. So really interesting guy. Yes, the breakup is back. Yeah, there you go. Bunky Mike, we're back. Most U.S. wars are started due to false flags. Indeed, James, indeed. And look at that national identity thing, right? We got the false flag from World War I. We got the false flag from, well, Pearl Harbor, think what you will. And then, of course, the Gulf of Tonkin, right when LBJ takes over, right? We get the massive escalation. If there wasn't Gulf of Tonkin and there wasn't LBJ, Vietnam would be a minor footnote in American history, just a minor footnote. But imagine we had conscription. Speaking of conscription, Taiwan conscription starting up and increasing as we speak. The Fed's actions caused the dollar to do better than ever versus other currencies, but the world faces economic recession as a result. Yeah, that's what I mean. The crisis of debt, disaster-based money. Yeah, that's the dollar milkshake theory that James is talking about here, which is, and it's what I've, this used to seem strange when I told people this at early Bitcoin. I would say to them, there's only one fiat money. There's only one. There's not two. There's one. And they'd say, no, what do you mean Canadian dollar? And I say, well, go use your Canadian dollar in another country, first of all. They're going to think you brought fake money. No one knows the Canadian dollar. And then, like we talk about a lot, what Bitcoin can be in our economic system, I liken it to water in the metric system. It's the measuring stick. It's how you get relative meaning to everything. Well, that same analogy applies for dollars in our current system. It is the measuring stick. It is. And then that makes it the only one. because everything is relative to the US dollar, there is no other money. They're all basically algorithmic stablecoins, all of them. And the algorithm is dynamic in that it's like, what are condos going for in your biggest city, and what's the vacancy of factories in your industrial heartland, and how much oil do you pump? But nevertheless, it's all relative to the US dollar. It only gains meaning relative to the US dollar. And as we've been talking about on this show, right, you've got the Koreans begging, please don't raise interest rates. We can't keep up with you. Well, guess where all the money is already gone? America looted the world between 20 and 20 and right now. It looted the world, right? Everyone brought their money to America or put it in American stocks. Everybody. It's everyone. So here we are, using the wrecking ball, using the dollar milkshake, and it's created all this trouble around the world. All of it, right? All of it. And national identity was part of the way this happened, right? Dex, they got the gift of consumerism after World War II. Yeah, that's what we talk about a lot on this show. Right? Humanity needs large batteries. Yeah, James Boyle's law. Liquid metal battery. Yeah, okay, correct. That was about the etymology. Yeah, mythology was etymology. Yeah. All right, team. First episode back, We'll get a more exciting, more high energy one. We'll be back tomorrow. My only programming notes are no show December 31st, New Year's Eve, because I fly early in the morning and I'll be boarding the plane while the show would normally be going on. And then January 1st, just because I can't guarantee I can set up when I get there based on flying and arriving on New Year's Eve and not really having a plan. So we're going to do episodes tomorrow, the following day. So we're the 28th, 29th, 30th. Yeah, 28th, 29th, 30th. And then 2 days off, but we'll be back January 2nd for sure. But we'll see you again tomorrow, team. It was great. I really missed you guys. This was a bummer. The house was too full. I could never have gotten even this much quiet and privacy in the past few days. So there was a house full of kids. Miss you all. Thanks for coming, and see you tomorrow, team. Ciao.